Hello, everyone. Welcome to FreightWaves Global Supply Chain Week. My name is Brasca. I'm a Group Vice President here at Yonder, focused on supply chain execution. And I'm joined by two fellow veterans of supply chain, Gary Berger, who's the president of Berger Business Consulting, and Pat Jones, who's director of supply chain execution at Yonder. Guys, welcome.
Great to be here, Fab.
Excellent. And what we're going to do, I'm going to have the guys just introduce themselves a little bit. But first, what we're going to do is have a little bit of a fireside chat today. And we're going to focus on the topic of overcoming silos in the digital value chain journey. So, Gary, why don't you start? Give us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, thanks, Fab. So, as you mentioned, I now have my own private consulting practice. Been doing that for about 3 years. Prior to that, about 30 years with PepsiCo. Worked primarily in the Frito-Lay division, but also worked across PepsiCo and was in charge of global supply chain as well as global digital transformation work across all PepsiCo. So glad to be here. Glad to support the chat.
Excellent, Pat.
Hey, Fab. Yeah, Pat Jones. I'm fairly new to Blue Yonder. I joined in August of last year. Prior to that, I spent 13 years with PepsiCo in the supply chain area with Gary, and we worked on many projects together. Most of my time there was spent in the global logistics, technologies, and strategy area. So we were rolling out transportation management, warehouse solutions globally, and driving a lot of value in the supply chain. Great to be here.
Great. Well, welcome to both of you gentlemen. And just for the audience, I've been in the supply chain space for almost 30 years, primarily in supply chain execution space. And a lot of it here actually with Blue Yonder, just traveling around the world, working with a lot of our major customers on their transformation journey. And so it's a real topical, important topic that we want to discuss. And I'm glad to be joined by my fellow veterans here, and I think we'll be able to shed some interesting light on the topic for everyone. So let me start with this first question, and I'll throw this out to you, Pat, first, and then maybe Gary, you can comment. We frequently hear about the term digital transformation, but what should digital transformation really mean to leaders in today's business world?
Yeah, that's a great question because I think everybody might have a different answer. I think the important thing is it's got to be more than a project mentality. It's not a technology project. I think the important thing is that you've got to be willing to look ground up at every aspect of operations and organization. So it's not a IT-driven initiative. It's got to be a business-led, P&L-driven, bottoms-up approach, using technology as the enabler, but not as the primary driver of the work. And to me, that's the key. Is it's different than digitization, which is simply putting in systems and digitizing your base. You've got to have that platform, that foundation. But to do transformation, you've got to then figure out how are you going to use it to do your business differently and not repeat what you've been doing before, but faster and with digital tech capabilities.
For many years now, we've been hearing this term, digital transformation, and it's easy to kick around that term and to not really kind of take a step back and understand what that really means. And if you think about, transformation, it is all about doing something, different. I would argue very different. You're transforming, right? So it should look different. And, digitizing, there are many ways to digitize your business. And I would say that every company has to look at first kind of what their true mission, vision, goals, strategic plan is, and understand, okay, where is the biggest value in working a digital solution. Pat mentioned that, it's not just a technology platform, but it's also, about the business process, and that needs to be transformed. It's about transforming your people capabilities, right? Because you've got to have the organization to not only lead a transformation initiative, but also to be there to run this transformation and run the digital solution when the project is done. And I would tell you that from what I've seen, many companies, and I'd say most good companies, have already done a really good job of optimizing kind of within their functional boundaries. But where digital transformation is really kind of the sweet spot is to optimize beyond what those natural boundaries are. That is across the entire supply chain. It's even beyond supply chain and into all their functional areas, and even within outside the companies, other companies, either upstream or downstream from the company. So it's really kind of about taking a whole different approach and a whole different view as to how to operate and how to run the business.
Yeah, I think those are important points. I was going to add that, as someone who's been on the technology side for most of his career, I've always pointed out to customers that they do need to engage in understanding changes in processes and people, not just the technology itself, and really looking to transform as opposed to just replicating. But I think in today's age, especially with the acceleration of capabilities that are out there, when you start talking about things like machine learning and data ingestion and just the art of the possible, I think it's even more important that companies think outside of what they currently know and think about what they could be doing. So in my mind, it's an incredibly exciting time in that regard. Gary, let me throw this one at you. What are the key steps a company needs to take prior to beginning a transformation journey?
I think that the very first thing that the company needs to wrap their mind around is, making sure they've got a relentless focus on driving the business value associated with that particular digital transformation. I mention that first because it's so easy to get a project approved and to mobilize a team and to start working against, a project plan and almost get lost as to, okay, what is that true business value that we're off to go do? And with any transformation project, historically, from what I've seen, these are more complicated, more complex initiatives. And we need to make sure that the project team is set up so that there's not a quick end date to, okay, when is the project supposed to be complete, and then kind of disband the project, pack up. I think that the project team needs to stay focused beyond the implementation to make sure that we really are driving kind of that business value from an end-to-end standpoint. Likewise, it's also very important to understand what those organizational capabilities are, both within kind of the program itself, but also from a capability to sustain the solution. It's also a critical aspect of it. I think that there is probably an incorrect belief that the more that you digitize and automate a solution, the less you need human interaction and humans to technicians and team members to kind of really know how the solution works. And I've always seen the opposite. You actually have to have people have a deeper understanding of the supply chain of the solutions in order for them to really leverage it, to its fullest intent. The final thing I'd add is that I've always found that there are some foundational requirements that are needed prior to launching an initiative. Pat and myself have some examples of this specifically from a PepsiCo standpoint, but it's really about what are those foundational elements that need to be put in place and need to be very robust in order for you to lay kind of a digital transformation initiative on top of that. That can be, technology, speed, capability, capacities. It can be, change management, leadership capabilities. It can be a numerous things, and it's different for every business. But realize that it's important to identify what those foundational requirements are and start working on those things, immediately, because there's too many times that we've seen you implement something on something, on a solution or ability that isn't, the foundation isn't there, and you end up having to do rework and that sort of thing. So really understanding kind of what that foundation is and understanding what the requirements are, and being true to yourself and the organization as to, okay, what's the real work that needs to take place is very important.
The only thing I'd add to that, and Gary brought it up, and I think it's a key point, is the value has to be front and center. And not only the value known to the group that's doing the work or starting the work, but the entire organization has to understand why they're going after it, or you're going to lose traction. You're going to lose the fringes, and the people that aren't involved directly aren't going to understand what this is all about, and they're going to lose interest or perhaps pull against it. So I think that's a key point that Gary brought up, is that value proposition has to be shared around the organization. Even if you're not directly part of it, you got to be rowing in the same direction, or else you're gonna lose that momentum.
I was going to ask you about, we were talking earlier about, the aspect of focusing on the transformation, right? And organizations thinking outside the box and not just replicating, what they have. So, how do you recommend organizations balance between the aspirational and the achievable?
Yeah, and that, another point that Gary raised is understanding the foundational elements, and the reference he made at PepsiCo. I think we had invested over years in some of the best of breed solutions across the supply chain. We had the best planning solutions, the best warehouse solutions, transportation solutions. But you've got to look at how does that foundation, how is it weaved together, and is it ready for that transformation? Because it turned out, even with all those investments, and they were good investments, and we had best people in each role, you still had the silos that had to be dealt with and managed. So all those investments, they were great investments, but when it came time for transformation, you had to really take a hard look and know where you were. In order to get to that aspirational goal, you had to start with some basics and start unwinding a few pieces and start rebuilding a few of those pieces that hadn't been necessarily done correctly or done with the long-term transformation vision. So I think that's the key, is know where you are, and be realistic about where you're beginning. So those aspirational goals should stay there. That's your vision, that's your mission. But your shorter term goals and the achievable goals keep building you towards that. And they're achievable because you started with a realistic picture of where you're beginning. And I think measuring is the key, is to show that progress. So you can keep showing the org, hey, we're in this for the long haul, but we're making wins, and those wins are measurable and we're tracking to them. And that's how you're going to keep the momentum going.
Yeah, Pat, I think that I'll add a couple things to that. I think that you mentioned kind of, figuring out what your wins are going to be early on. I think, defining your priorities, your sequence, your roadmap, and then realizing it's very important for the organization to see that you get quick wins, right? So make the transformation in bite-sized pieces and make sure that you can get some wins under your belt. That does a couple things. It certainly rallies support. You've identified an imperative for change, and the organization can start to see that you're on that journey, that transformation. The other thing that it does, and very important, is that you want it to be, we always talked about this, in our previous careers, is, being self-funding, right? You want to start up an initiative and get some productivity and some cash flow, positive cash flow, so you can reinvest that in future digital transformation initiatives. So, have kind of this self-funding, early wins, I think is very important as well.
Yeah, no, that's good feedback. And maybe I'm gonna throw an ad lib one at you. My experience is, in a lot of times, again, coming from the technology world, customers are so eager to, minimize cost of a project and really kind of cram everything all in at once. And a lot of times they're a little reticent to do exactly what you laid out because they want to get at, this theoretical end state of a project rather than framing it out. I mean, how have you guys dealt with that in the past?
The first thing you have to start out with in the very beginning is, and I mentioned, what is the mission, vision, strategic plan? You definitely want, your executive team to be, very much, not just on board, but very engaged in the initiative. And they need to really understand, what kind of risks are they willing to take on, and what kind of value equation are they looking at, and bring them into the whole project discussion from a steering committee standpoint. I think that that's very important when you're working on any kind of big change to the organization, because it's no longer disassociated from a project team, but kind of working together in kind of a common goal and working against that. So that, yeah, I mean, there's always trade-offs that you have to make. There's decisions that you have to make around when to speed up, when to slow down. The other thing that I would tell you is that it's important for a team to understand what they're off to go do, but not necessarily all the details about how it's going to be done. A digital transformation initiative is probably, there's going to be a lot of learning throughout. The team has to be very agile, learn, adapt as they're going through. And I can tell you that every good project I've been on has always ended up a little bit different than what we thought it was going to be in the beginning. But the important thing is that, did it deliver the business value? Yes. Did it exceed the business value you always wanted to, right? So it's important to kind of, keep, your eye on the bullseye from that standpoint, and not get caught up on, at an executive level of all the how it's going to be done, but understand and engage them from a risk, from a mitigation standpoint. And are we still working and approaching to achieve what we're off to go do from a mission standpoint?
So I've got one more for you guys, and I'll throw it out to both of you. But Pat, maybe I'll throw it out to you first, especially since I know as a colleague now, this is entirely what you focus on. How have you positioned value in order to gain broad support for a transformation?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely different views of value. You've got your financial, which is a lot of people think financial only, but there's a lot of other type of values you've got to focus on. What's important to the company? What's important to the leadership? And internally, depending on who you're talking to, you've got to touch on their key points. So is it, growth in a market? Is it profitability in a market? Is it cutting costs in a market? What are the value drivers that are important? And you've got to have them all at the ready. And when you talk digital transformation, you've got to be able to point to, here's the different takes on value you're going to get. Some are bigger than others, but they're all going to be there. So how do you lay that out? But definitely the value is a front and center. And the ROI they're going to get out of this approach, this program, because whether it's finance and they want to see a return on investment and cash flow returning a break-even point fast, or it's operations, they want to see cost cutting that hits the targets. I mean, you've got to flavor it for the audience, but sell it in as together, is that you can't parcel it out and only get your benefit. You've got to go after the whole investment, and lay it out. And to Gary's point, you've got to show the wins along the way.
Gary, your thoughts?
Good projects, every project should always have a very clear success criteria established early on. And that success criteria is not just business KPIs, but also, how are we going to ensure that the business process that we've re-engineered, how do we ensure that is being followed? How do we make sure that, you know, the cultural elements that we're working to change, how are we going to measure that? Do we need to change the way people are recognized and rewarded in the organization? I can tell you that, you know, anytime that you look at, you know, an orchestrated end-to-end type solution, just about every organization I've been involved with has always, you know, prior to doing that, recognizes and rewards their team members against, you know, departmental objectives and even individual objectives. And so you almost have to start breaking that down and say, okay, well, how do we recognize and reward people's individual contributions across the broader supply chain? These are very challenging, very difficult things to go tackle. This is where the things that you have to start thinking about when you're starting to change, you know, an end-to-end supply chain and do these digital transformation initiatives.
No, thanks, Gary. You know, guys, this has been, I think, a really great discussion. Let me close it out with just some thoughts, particularly from a technology perspective. Since, you know, that's where I've spent most of my career. And Gary, you said something earlier that just stuck in my brain and is really close to home for me, which is about how, as an industry, and you know, whether you're at you know, a manufacturer, retailer, or like myself in technology, you know, I think as an industry, we've done a really good job at optimizing within a silo. And certainly from a technology perspective, done a fantastic job, you know, building more and more capabilities and really driving efficiencies in a silo. But in today's world, it's about breaking those silos down. When we're thinking about transformation, we need to break down those silos. And one of the interesting things that you know, we're trying to drive with our capabilities at Blue Yonder is thinking more and more from a use case perspective rather than a function perspective. So, you know, like you guys, you know, my upbringing was supply chain execution. You know, I started in the transportation space and you know, now spent a lot of time in the warehouse space. But more and more, and certainly, you know, my experience have had a lot of exposure to planning and replenishment and those types of things. But more and more, what we're seeing is customers are looking for outcomes. They're looking for end results and, you know, value that they're trying to achieve, and the function becomes less important. It's about now a collection of capabilities that where the silo itself becomes less important than the unification of the workflow. And so I invite, you know, the audience to come visit Blue Yonder. You know, we've had great capabilities and history in supply chain planning and execution, and our whole mission is about breaking down those silos via a unified platform. So on that note, Gary, Pat, thank you very much for your time. Hopefully the audience finds a lot of value out of this. And my thanks to FreightWaves for putting this together. And come visit us at blueyonder.com. Thank you very much, everyone.